Hello and welcome to episode 26, all about psychic kids. I'm your host, Dr. Jennifer Lisa Vest, and you're listening to Journal of a Medical Intuitive. Today I want to talk about psychic kids. It's something I've been really passionate about for years. I even taught some classes for psychic kids back in Oakland a few years ago. And I've toyed with the idea of creating a psychic kids workshop for many years, and I've had lots of my clients and students express an interest in there being a class for psychic kids. I know there was a TV show for a while about psychic kids, and I was really excited to see that was airing. I really think this is something that needs to happen, that we need to have schools for children to help them develop their gifts. There are a lot of kids out there who are naturally psychic, but they're not really being encouraged, and in fact, they're being discouraged by the school system, by society, by the media, and also sometimes by their parents. You know, so many people don't understand psychic gifts that when they see them in children, they don't always recognize them. Then, too, a lot of people are very, are frightened by psychic gifts, and they don't want that for their child. They don't want their child to be a weirdo. They don't want their child to have these weird gifts that are going to set them apart from other kids and make their life difficult. So it makes sense that, some parents are going to discourage their kids from developing their psychic gifts. I was one of those psychic kids, and it was challenging for me, even though I had a psychic mom and a psychic grandmother, because I wasn't being raised by them my whole life. And so, my great-grandma died when I was 10, and of course I only saw her occasionally, and she was psychic. And then my mother, I was separated from her at the age of 9, and being raised by people who didn't not only didn't support me, but I had a stepmother who used to threaten me with the loony bin because I would have these psychic experiences. The one that really got me into trouble was premonition, and so a lot of times people who are precogs will relate to this. If you tell the future, it usually doesn't go well for you. Why? Because a lot of the types of information that we get as precognitives, they're kind of scary, right? So what do we end up getting? We like predict people's death, or we predict some tragedy, some calamity, right? So when I was 12, I told my family that my cousin was dead. And this was a cousin that I didn't know particularly well, but I was fond of his mother, my Aunt Arlene. And this was her son, Michael, and I had this really intense, psychic dream where I saw that he died, and I saw some other details that he was murdered. And I just woke up with this strong sense that I had to tell somebody, and someone needed to know. And so I told my parents, and they were like, "You're crazy." And and then we got a call, right, the next day that, indeed her very young, he was in his 20s, young son had died. And the mother suspected of it to be a murder, but the police did not pursue it. And she was very distraught because they were treating it like, I think, a suicide. And I had gotten a clear message from my dead cousin that it was not a suicide, that he had been killed. But when I told my parents this, their reaction was, "Okay, we're going to the funeral. Do not say anything to anyone about what you dreamt. You're just going to freak people out." And so I got the message really early on that this wasn't acceptable, right? It wasn't acceptable to have information like this. And so I didn't say anything to my great aunt Arlene, which I regret. I regret now that I'm an adult. I regret that I didn't say something to her, because maybe she would have found it comforting to be told that, I spoke to him, he was okay, but that he wanted her to know that he was killed. Now, psychic kids, they can have all kinds of experiences or symptoms to let you know that they're psychic kids. And so a psychic kid might do what I did. They might predict the future. They might have a sense about people, like a very good sense. Like when somebody's a bad character, they'll know first before anyone else does. Like, that's a bad guy, or they don't want to be around that person. They'll have strong reactions. People will say, "Oh, your kid's just super sensitive," or they're an introvert, or they don't like people or something. But in fact, it won't be that the kid doesn't like people. It's that the kid doesn't like very specific people. And those specific people do end up being bad characters if you pay attention. So that would be like a budding clairsentient. And then you also have kids who are clairaudients, right, who can hear things. And if they're clairaudient, you might think, oh, this kid is just talking to their imaginary friend all the time. If you see them having one-way conversations. And sometimes it's because they're a clairaudient or they're a medium, and they're actually talking to a little spirit child or a spirit person, but you can't see them, and so you think they're talking to themselves or their imaginary friend. And so one thing you can do, if your child has imaginary friends, ask them a lot of questions about them, and you might be surprised that their imaginary friends have a lot of details that don't really fit with what your child knows. So your child hasn't been exposed to the information that would allow them to make this up. So if you ask them a lot of questions about their imaginary friends, you might find out that they're from a different time period, that they have a huge backstory, that they have families. Like, there's a whole lot of details there. And the details do not appear to be sourced from your child's knowledge base, like the toys they play with, the shows they watch, the people that they're around. And that would be an indication that, okay, maybe this kid isn't imagining their friend. Maybe they're actually having some type of spirit communication. Now, in the psychic class that I did lead, I had about 15 kids, and they were all different ages, from very young to teenagers, to like young teenagers, like 12, 13, 14. And I would ask questions, and they would all say yes. It was across the board. And so I would ask questions like, have you ever heard, have you ever met somebody who, is from a different time period? I would just ask them these different questions, and they were like, yeah. And so I really do think that we need to develop some courses for these kids. Now, I recently got some information from my guides about the psychic kids incarnating now. And so in the past, we've had different names, right? We had the rainbow children, the indigo children. I was one of those. The star seeds, right? These are the kids who are hybrids, who have some type of origin in another star system, or some sort of a connection to another star system. Indigo kids is an idea. There's been several books written about indigo kids that were coming in with what we now call a neurodivergence, which was being diagnosed as like ADHD or autism or Asperger's. But at the same time that they had these neurodivergences, they also had psychic gifts. So they were like highly intuitive, very creative, and also very focused on service, wanting to be of benefit to humanity. And so, of course, that's not true of all neurodivergent kids. So it's not the case that just because you're neurodivergent that you're going to be psychic or that you're going to really care about humanity. But that particular subset of kids that both have what's perceived as a neurodivergence and also have these psychic gifts and this love for humanity, that's what we call indigo. And then there's also another term, crystal children, rainbow children. And so there have been theories about these people incarnating for a while, different types of humans incarnating with a certain level of psychic gifts. And, everyone doesn't believe in these classifications, right? Because when a child has ADHD, it's not insignificant. If a child has autism, it's not insignificant. And so you can't just kind of say, oh, they're just different. They have these gifts. Because in our society, it's very hard for people, both children and adults, with ADHD to function. Now, once our society changes, that will no longer be the case. But for now, it is the case. For now, because our educational system is very linear, because, Our jobs are very linear because our society is set up in such a way. It's very difficult for people with ADHD to function successfully in the current society without some type of adaptation or medication or some type of treatment. And the same is true for autism. And so when you have people saying, oh, they're just different, you're going to have some pushback, of course, from parents and doctors and teachers who are saying, yeah, this is more than just difference. These kids are really struggling, right? They're really having a hard time. And so you have to be compassionate about that. You can't just say, oh, they're just different. They're really struggling. And so we have to address that. We don't just say, these kids have special gifts, leave them alone. We have to say, okay, these kids have special gifts and they're really struggling. So how do we help them? And so I think in the future, we're going to have a more, comprehensive kind of holistic approach to dealing with neurodivergence. We're not going to just see it as a pathology, and we're not going to just see it as a gift. We're going to have a more nuanced understanding of, this is something that has its benefits and its drawbacks depending upon the context that the person finds themselves in. Now, we've seen throughout history that a lot of geniuses who have changed our society have been neurodivergent, so Edison, Einstein, Tesla, Steve Jobs, right? A lot of these inventors, a lot of these change agents have had these types of neurodivergences. And so you can see that there's been a kind of a correlation in some cases between that neurodivergence and genius or creativity or the ability to draw an intuition to really make changes in society. But when you look at those examples, what you see is that, it's primarily white men who are able to have kind of extreme neurodivergence and still be very successful. And so that's something we have to change in our society, because when women have ADHD, they often don't have the support that men have. So men can have ADHD, but then they have wives and secretaries who do everything for them, and that allows them to focus on their genius and not have to be concerned with things like tying their shoes and answering their mail. So like Einstein, was reputed to be unable to tie his own shoes. He could not dress himself. He could not answer his own mail. He couldn't make his own food, or, he couldn't really do anything. He had a lot of challenges, but he had people in his life. He had a wife who did all those things for him. He had a couple of wives, and he had other people that were just doing all of those things for him so that he could focus on his physics, his math. We don't really have the same situation with women, and we don't really have the same situation to the same extent with people in certain economic classes or in certain countries where they don't have the resources. And so for people who want to celebrate the neurodivergent psychic kids and who want to argue that we should not medicate them, we should not treat them in any way, we should not treat this as a pathology, those people are going to also have to create some structures in society to take care of these people. Like, they're going to need help. And we're going to need to make some adjustments in society so that they can do things differently, right? So, for example, when a kid has ADHD, they might have a hard time handing assignments in on time, losing assignments, remembering what the instructions are, remembering when things are due. And our current educational system actually grades students based on those things. If you can't hand your stuff in on time, if you can't remember the assignment, if you lose your you get a bad grade, which has absolutely nothing to do with your level of intelligence or how much you learned. So we would have to change the school structure, right? If we want these kids who are neurodivergent to be able to be successful. We would also have to set up, more structures, more assistance for people. And this is relevant to the whole issue of psychic kids, because there often is this correlation between psychic gifts in children and neurodivergence. And the reason I'm bringing this up now is because I just got a download from my guides about the newer generations of kids. And I wanted to share some of that. What they were telling me was that these new generations, Generation Z and the Alpha kids, is that they're coming in with, we're seeing in them a lot of mental illness. And some people are saying, well, it's because of the pandemic. And certainly that was a factor, that these children had their development interrupted by this global pandemic that, interfered with their ability to socialize and to have those kind of normal developmental steps. But even that probably isn't enough to fully explain the extremely high levels of mental illness among Generation Z. And Alpha's still young, but we might see the same thing in that generation. And what my guides told me is that there's an important cause for this. There's an important reason that this is happening. And they said it's because the brains of these newer children are different. The brains are evolving, but they might not be seen as evolving yet, right? Because sometimes it takes us a while to recognize a change in our society as a positive change. We might tend to focus on it as a negative change, especially if there are negative side effects, as there is in this case. And so what they said is that the amygdala portion of the brain in these newer generations is less developed, or less developed might not be the right word, but they said it's more like an infant amygdala. So that if you were to compare the amygdalas of this generation to the amygdalas of the next generation up, the millennials, the Gen X's, you would see that their amygdalas they resemble more the amygdala of a younger child. So they're not, if you look at their age and then you do a scan of their brain, you would say, wait, this scan looks like the brain scan of a child, but I'm looking at a teenager, right? And so they said this was the case, and this is something that only science can prove. And so, a lot of the information that I get and that I deliver on my podcast is information that, can be proven right or wrong. And that's what I like about it. That's why I'm a medical intuitive. I like the marriage of science and the intuitive. I think we have to always work together. We can't just trust anything that a psychic says, and we can't just trust anything that a scientist says. We have to use science to check intuition, and intuition to check science. And so this is something that can be verified. People can do brain scans. And so I'm predicting in the future, these brain scans will be done, and people will figure out, doctors and scientists will figure out, oh, this is what's going on. This explains why this generation appears to be so hypersensitive, right? There's high rates of depression and anxiety. And there's this incredible sensitivity in this generation where they're like, oh, we don't like bright lights. We don't like the music like this. We don't like our clothes. The clothes are too rough, right? There are all these what these other generations view as hypersensitivities. And so there's a lot of critique, right, of this generation. Oh, this generation, or these next generations, they're defective. They don't know how to take care of themselves. They can't function in the world. They can't handle stress the way that other generations can handle stress. They're soft, right? We hear all these critiques. Oh, what's wrong with these kids? Why can't they handle anything? They don't know how to do things that we did when we were young. They're too dependent. They're not self-sufficient, right? They're constantly talking about their feelings, right? And so there's like a lot of, we don't understand, right? The older generations are like, what's going on? We don't understand these kids. And what's happening is they're being, diagnosed and treated for lots of mental illnesses. And so all of these kids are on medication, and yet it's not working, right? They're taking antidepressants, they're taking, anti-anxiety, they're taking all these medications, and the kids are like, it's not working. And, the therapists, the doctors, they don't know what to do. because they don't understand that the reason the medicine's not working is because the cause of these mental health conditions is not what they think it is, right? So they're looking at, what the causes were in the past. They're not looking at the structure of the brain, right? They're not looking for structural changes in the brain. Nobody's setting their kids in for brain scans to find out if their amygdala is not functioning properly, right? That's not happening. And because that's not happening, the treatment's not working. So this is the information I was given. And time will tell if I'm right. If I'm wrong, I'll take the L in the future. But, I hope that this research gets done. Because what they told me is that these changes that are happening in the brain are happening because the brain is evolving so that more and more people will be able to express psychic gifts, and in particular, telepathy. And so they said that the changes to the amygdala are happening because it's going to help the brain to develop the ability to be telepathic, as well as the development of other gifts. And so, what they were telling me is that we're basically giving birth to generations of children that are going to be highly psychic in very specific ways. And that this has to do with the way that humanity is changing, that we're going to be evolving into a society that is connected telepathically. And so we're going to have a different way of communicating in the future. It's not going to be all mediated by technology, that we're going to be able to have these direct connections. And that this mental illness part is a side effect of these brain changes. I thought that was really interesting, and I decided to share it, even though it's always risky to share something like this because people will say, oh, that sounds crazy or whatever, or you don't have any proof. And I don't have any proof yet, but I really hope that someone starts doing these brain scans, and eventually they probably will. When they've run out of other treatments, somebody's going to say, hey, let's start doing scans and figure out if there's something structural going on. But I think it's important to think about these new generations coming in with more psychic gifts, and to think about how we don't really have the schools in place. We don't have the training centers. We don't have the receptiveness, right? Right now, how are we viewing these kids? They're just mentally ill. They're just messed up. They're defective. They can't function properly, right? That's the way, we're perceiving them. And that's not really helpful. These kids are our future. And so these kids are going to force us to change. And ultimately, it's going to be good for the planet. But it's going to be a little struggle along the way because of this perception, right? That we have a whole generation of young people with mental illness. Now, although it's kind of more extreme now, right? We have this whole generation where, I don't know the exact numbers, but really high rates are on pharmaceutical medications for their brain, for their mental illness. Just really high rates, and really high rates of diagnosis. So you can look this up and see that there has been a statistically significant increase in the rates of mental illness in these younger generations. Now, psychic kids have always been perceived as weird, right? And so when I was a kid, decades ago, I was threatened with the loony bin. Fortunately, back then, I didn't go to a therapist. I didn't get diagnosed with anything. I didn't get put on medication. But it certainly scared me, the thought that I could be crazy, that if I'm talking to spirit or having these dreams about the future or feeling other people's symptoms in my body because I was a out of control clairsentient as a child, that, maybe I'm crazy. And, fortunately, because of that fear, I did do a lot of therapy in my life, and I did get evaluated through many, many tests. And I can say now that I have lots of proof that I'm not crazy, that I don't have any mental illnesses, because I've been thoroughly screened. And I did that in part because I wanted to make sure that, I wasn't. Now, what I did was I went into a field where things can be verified. Medical intuition is one of those fields in psychic work where it's verifiable, right? If I tell you that I see a spirit guide with you who wears a tall hat and a robe, you can't verify that, right? Because where can we find proof that you have a spirit guide? But if I tell you that you have a growth in the back of your uterus, and you go to a doctor and you get an MRI and they find a growth in the back of your uterus, you have verified what I said. And that's an example, a true example. I once told a woman she had a growth in the back of her uterus. She got an MRI and she indeed had one. So I have a lot of stories like that where the information I've gotten as a medical intuitive is verifiable, right? I had another case with this woman who had a genetic abnormality in her, I think it was her axis or her cervical spine. And I described it to her and I told her to get an x-ray. And she got an x-ray and sure enough, that's what she had. And it explained her symptoms in a way that, they had never been able to explain this pain she had in her jaw. So, medical intuition is verifiable. And I like that. I like that it marries intuition and science. And we also have mediumship, which is verifiable, right? We have what's called evidential mediumship, which is what I was trained in by the spiritualists. And that's where you don't just talk to someone and say, oh, I have a spirit here. He says he's your father. He wants to tell you he loves you. No, in evidential mediumship, what you do is you say, I have a spirit here. And then you describe the spirit in enough detail that the person you're talking to can verify that it's their relative. And so you have to say things like, I have a man, he's tall, he's 6'1", he's got brown hair, he worked as a banker or something to do with finance, he died in his 30s, he lived in the mountains, right? You give several bits of information, and then once you have given enough that the client says, I know who this is, that's my father, he had dark hair, he was 6'1", 6'1", he lived in Colorado, he liked to ski the mountains, he worked in a bank, right? That was my father. So it's like, it's evidence, right? You're not just making it up, you're getting information you can't possibly know, and someone's able to verify it, right? And so there are forms of intuitive work that are verifiable. And so we have these psychic kids being born in larger numbers. And that can also be verified. There are people in other countries who are doing research on psychic kids, who are putting them in laboratories, who are doing brain scans, who are subjecting them to testing to see if they're accurate in the things that they say. And so we could do that. We could be testing these kids. We could produce, scientific reports verifying that indeed these kids have gifts. And so I hope that happens in the future. I really hope that we start providing, schools for these kids, that we start providing more conscious and aware treatment for their mental illness. So it's like, okay, you're depressed all the time, but we're not seeing any chemical changes in your brain. We're not seeing any trauma in your life right now. We're not seeing the usual things we would see with depression. So, and it also happens to be the case that you're an empath, that you can pick up other people's feelings quite accurately, that you can pick up other people's symptoms, that you're like a natural medical intuitive. You can tell your friends, oh, you have a stomach ache, oh, you have this. Maybe we need to put you into a class to develop your medical intuition and to learn how to get control of your clairsentience. And then maybe that will cause the depression to resolve itself, because maybe the depression you have is not really yours, but you're picking it up clairsentiently from people around you, right? So wouldn't it be nice if we had that kind of approach to these psychic kids? And then if we had these schools, we had these programs where the kid could go to psychic class and could learn how to get control of their gifts so that they no longer felt like their gifts were controlling them, and they could start to feel less afraid. They could start to find a way to use their gifts to help others. It's really going to help our whole society if we can really change the way we interact with psychic kids. I think it's important that if you have a psychic kid, that you talk to them, ask them questions, take it seriously when they tell you something, and then find out if it's true. I mean, don't believe everything they say, but if they say something that's going to happen and then it happens, then say, you know what, you were right. You got that right. Or if they pick up something about a person, investigate that. Were their hunches correct? If they, say they're talking to spirit, introduce them to a medium, enroll them in a class, give them a book, have them evaluate it. Find out if there's a way you can support them in developing their gifts. And of course, you also have to monitor their mental health. I'm never going to be one of those people that argues that every kid who has psychic gifts or who thinks they have psychic gifts, that they should not be evaluated for mental illness. No, because sometimes, as is the case with this new generation, there is a combination. There's mental illness alongside psychic gifts. Sometimes it's because the psychic gifts aren't being taken seriously or aren't being allowed to express themselves. And sometimes it's just a side effect, as the case with this amygdala. So now these kids that are super sensitive, that are having this, who are getting overstressed over little things, right? What we perceive as little things because their amygdala is underdeveloped. There are ways to change our society to make it easier for them. And we know this because we take care of small children. And we know that about small children, right? We know that about infants. When you have an infant, you can't take them to a place with loud music or bright lights. You have to insulate them. You have to put them in a protective environment. And the same with young children. You can't expose them to movies with violence or to people who are too aggressive. Like, you have to be careful. You don't dress them in rough clothing, right? We know that when somebody is very young, that they're easily overstimulated. We know that about infants and small children. And so we do know how to adapt an environment for a child who is overstimulated to make it possible for them to be comfortable. We know how to do that. We're just not used to doing that with kids that are like 15, 20 years old, right? We're expecting them to outgrow that because normally they would. Normally your amygdala would develop and you would no longer be overstimulated by so many things. But if what I'm being told is true, and these young people, some of whom are adults, right, are responding to stimulation the way an infant responds, then we can change the environment to make it more comfortable for them. That is certainly an option. Or at least we could have certain environments designed for them. So that's what I would recommend. But I'm really curious to hear from people who have psychic kids. And if you think that your kid is a baby medical intuitive, I would really love to hear about that, especially kids who are a baby medical intuitive, someone who is picking up other people's illnesses, or they're getting sick every time someone else in the family is sick. Like they're getting it not because it's contagious, but, dad sprains his ankle and then, his daughter all of a sudden is limping on the same foot. And they're like, it hurts. And you might think they're making it up, that they're just copying dad. But if it's a baby medical intuitive, they might actually be feeling those symptoms in their body. All right. They might also be able to see when someone's dying or when someone is very ill without being told. And they might, baby medical intuitive might want to avoid hospitals or sick people. If you try to get them to visit sick relatives or go to a hospital, they might put up a big fight or have a tantrum or just be very upset about being around a lot of sick people. This might be true for nursing homes too. They might have a hard time going to nursing homes because so many of the old people are in pain and they can pick it up. So, please comment any experiences that you have with psychic kids, or if you yourself were a psychic kid. I'd love to hear from you. This has been your host, Dr. Jennifer Lisa Vest. This is Journal of a Medical Intuitive. And a couple of announcements. I have a couple of new courses on the horizon. I just launched a new Akashic Records course, which you can find on my website at www.drvest Medical Intuitive. That's DRVEST medicalintuitive.com. And so I have a course that will teach you how to read your own Akashic Records. I started reading the Akashic Records in the context of medical intuition because it allowed me to access spiritual causes of illness for people. But most people find them helpful for getting clarity on your life purpose, on your gifts, on your past lives, and also it's a place you can go to answer just really big questions about things that are going on in your life, patterns, really intense relationships, major pivots. What's the purpose? What's the meaning behind them? You can ask that question in the Akashic Records. And then I also have an upcoming class that's going to start May 2nd on the Shift Network called Soul Growth and Psychic Development. It's a 7-week live video course where I'll be covering life purpose, gifts, how you can develop your consciousness in alignment with the development of your gifts. And you can see the links on the podcast to get to that live class. Thank you, and I will see you next time.